Okay.
Janina, if you wish, we can get started.
Yeah, I think we can start. So, yeah, welcome to this series, Books in Conversation. It's the first time we organize at the Albert Hirschman Democracy Center an event with this idea of having more than one publication on similar topics in conversation, just to discuss or to put in common what are the main findings, what are the topics attracting or driving the idea of editing or writing these books, these chapters. All the books are related to democracy, democratic innovation, citizens' participation from different approaches. My role is just to introduce it from the Albert Hirschman and to introduce Min Roushams. He's a professor of political science at the Catholic University of Leuven, and Min will moderate this conversation. So, Min, I give you the place to talk.
Thank you very much, Janina. Thank you very much to the center in Geneva. Hello, everyone online and on site. Very pleased to be here because we will be discussing 3, possibly 4 books, because I need to make this announcement. Britt Geisel might join, but maybe she will not be able to join, so let's see. But at least we still have 3 amazing books on our plate and for today. Without further ado, I would suggest that we get started because we have imagined 2 sets of questions, so 2 rounds of questions. The first one I would summarize in is the why question. Why did the authors write this book? What is the main contribution? And the second one is a so what question, or what is the remaining challenge that needs still to be tackled in the future by other people in the room maybe. And then after these 2 rounds of discussions, then we, of course, will open the real conversations with people around the table in Geneva, but also around the virtual table. The order was not randomly selected, but I thought we could first give the floor by the person who is the further away from Geneva, which is Adrian Bua. Adrian, the floor is yours for the first question, if you wish.
Okay, so we're doing first question 4 people, and then we go back to the second. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much. It's really great to be here. Our book, what the main contribution of our edited collection, really to understand that we need to go back to an earlier article that my co-author Sonia Busu and I published in the European Journal of Political Research, published in 2021, where we sort of took issue with the depiction of democratic innovation, or more specifically participatory governance, developed by Mark Warren, which he sort of understood as being composed of institutions that are mostly led by bureaucrats or government agencies to address governance problems. And he sort of called this governance-driven democratization. So he's sort of arguing that it's in the sphere of governance that a new frontier for the deepening of democracy is opening, and not in this, unlike, you know, democratization in the past occurring through political contention. But we thought that this failed to capture, whilst it did sort of capture very well the kind of zeitgeist in participatory governance before the financial crash, especially, we thought it failed to capture the influence of social movements and grassroots practices in opening new spaces of participatory governance. And now one clear example and paradigmatic example would be the development of participatory budgeting, which, as we probably all know, starts in Porto Alegre in Brazil. And it's born out of an alliance between 4 different kinds of social movements and the left-wing political party, the Partido de los Trabajadores. Now, this experiment was born out of really socially transformative ambitions and was basically a left political strategy that saw the participatory budget as the spearhead of a profound sort of democratization of state and society. As we know, as the experiment matured and traveled to other parts of the world, became adopted and promoted by the World Bank, it became a more technocratic affair that eroded much of its focus on social justice. And we thought that Warren's depiction reflected too much this latter kind of technocratic version, leaving aside the radical and transformative roots of participatory governance. So what inspired us were the widespread use of participatory processes in Spain between 2015 and 2019, where lots of movement parties took City Hall in many major urban centres and attempted to implement a range of more radical approaches to participation. And in counterpoint to Warren, we call it democracy-driven governance. So the book is structured around this idea of democracy-driven governance and asks to what extent these kinds of experiences of social movement-led participatory governance transfer to other cases in other parts of the world and at different political scales. So the Spanish context was a very particular one. It led itself to a sort of critical political economy framing because of the large impact that the global financial crash and austerity politics had on opening this kind of political window of opportunity. But the book deals with other contexts as well. So there's chapters on collective candidacies in Brazil, anti-colonial struggles in Greenland, climate protests in France, participatory arts and prefiguration, and different, not just different geographical areas, but also different kinds of participatory experiences. And the main contribution is that whilst we can analytically distinguish between these processes, GDD and DDG, analytically they blend into each other. And I'm coming to the end now. Sorry if I'm over time. So as we saw in Porto Alegre, radical processes can be co-opted into something that looks the same, but is entirely different in content. And we often focus on this, but even conservative or technocratic processes can be shaped by the resistance of participants within spaces of participation and turn into something more radical. And this is less noticeable and often occurs at lower scales. But Giovanni Allegretti, for example, picks this up in Greenland, and Marcus Holdo touches upon this in participatory budgeting in Argentina. So the main point is that there's dynamism between these different spaces, between change and co-optation, and that this shapes the field of participatory governance. And that's sort of one of the key lessons cutting through each of these chapters that tries to capture this sort of dynamism.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for this excellent pitch. And of course, this is good food for thought for later. Before further ado, I welcome Brigitte Geisel, who could join us, so that's very good. And if it's fine for you, Brigitte, I would give you the floor to answer the first question, so the why question. Why did you write the book?
Microphone.
No, yes, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, yes. Why did I write the book? I mean, the whole thing started with representative democracy is in crisis, how to proceed, and what should we do as political scientists. And my problem was, not the problem, but I have been working a lot on democratic innovations. And at some point, I felt it's a very paternalistic approach. We tell people what is good for them, what they need. And so we advocate like our favorite model of democracy or the practice we think is a very good thing. And we kind of insinuate that this is the best thing citizens should do. And I mean, there's so many models and practices that are presumably redeemers or that help, like the concept of open democracy, autocratic alternatives, deliberative systems, or this whole practices like movements, mini publics, deliberative practices, referendums, participatory budgeting, liquid democracy, and more. So there is so much going on in the literature discussing or explaining or telling people what should be done and what would be the best democratic innovation. And my approach was to say, no, probably not. There's surely no one size fits all. And there is surely no predetermined model or practice that is the best way for all citizens and all democracies. That's why I kind of invented this concept of democracy of self-governing that says instead of advertising certain models or practices, we should go really back to the origin idea. And Jane Mansbridge once said this, that the task of political science is to help citizens to govern themselves. And this is what we should aim for, to help citizens and communities to find out what is the best way of self-governing in their specific context. What do they really want? Which practices fit? Which procedures fit? And then adapt them continuously throughout. Because no democratic system can, have institutions for eternity. This is already said by Eric Wright or others. And then my whole book explains that maybe different kinds of communities need different kinds of self-governing. Communities which completely trust their representatives, they might say, we are very fine with this, we don't need anything else. Other communities with very untrustworthy politicians might even get rid of elections and say, we need something completely different. We do now liquid democracy, vote delegation, mini publics, direct democracy, and so on. I argued very strongly in my book that democracy is not a board game or a card game where we as experts know the rules and then we teach the communities what they should do. It's really the other way around. We should help them to find out what they actually need and to help them to decide which rules they want to apply for themselves. There are also some empirical arguments. Of course, democracies are much more stable when they are in line with citizens' preferences. They are more inclusive when citizens are involved in the decision-making, in the constitution-making, in the rule-making, and they are more beneficial for ordinary people. One of my favorite examples is always the Irish case. I mean, you are all familiar with the abortion laws when the parliament, consisting of mainly older men, not really interested in abortion, didn't want to touch the topic. But when we had the Citizens' Assembly, half men, half women, old, young, and then they decided we need to change abortion laws in Ireland. We need to have a more liberal, we need to have more liberal laws. This would have never happened if the experts, the politicians in parliament would have decided. It just changed just when it was a participatory procedure of how the constitution should look like. We have some experiences with this way of participatory constitution building, participatory lawmaking in Chile, in Ireland, in South Africa, in Iceland, of course. But none of them really, as you know, I can tell more about it, but you're more familiar with them like I do. But they're really a far cry away from what I think should actually happen to enable citizens to decide, to deliberate and decide how their democracy should really look like. I mean, as you know, the Icelandic case was, intricately built. I mean, it was a beautiful case, and then it just stopped because Parliament was no longer interested. So this is not what we actually need. So that was the reason why I wrote the book. I thought I have to get away from this paternalistic approach of, telling citizens what they should do and just more help them to find out what is good for them. This was the reason why I wrote the book.
Thank you very much, Brigitte. Very insightful, and to be, of course, continuing the conversation. But before going further, let's go to a third book by Bernard Rebert. Bernard, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The why, the famous why question. This is precisely the problem in deliberation when it is thought with the requirement of argumentation or search of justifications confronted to a moral pluralism, and not only the fact of moral pluralism, as John Rawls put it. So it's a book written by a philosopher, but a kind of embedded philosophers, and we had 4 years very exciting in France with at least 4 huge national debates. So in this book, responsible deliberation between conversation and considerations, conditions for a great democratic debate, and in a set entitled Innovation and Responsibility. So I think and this is one of the main claims, there is no democracy without responsible deliberation. Deliberation only as a discussion without any kind of responsibilities is a kind of nonsense or too easy game. It's not just a respectful discussion without mutual recognition of individual and institutional responsibilities. Under what conditions can we speak of democratic innovations? A kind of question that I address in the book. It's a monograph. What are the conditions for a satisfactory democratic debate on a normative, not paternalistic, but normative and practical levels? And this philosophical work deals in great depth with the normative conditions of democracy resituated in the debates of the most fertile theory we have, that of deliberative democracy. And my book discusses, among others, the contribution of those who are recognized as its founders, Rawls and Habermas, in order to show their disagreements and the limits of the solutions they propose. They are very kind warnings. Moreover, there is insistence on the fact that these theorists do not consider that their work can offer the guarantees for real debates between individuals. They speak respectively of conjecture for Rawls and fiction for Habermas, and a lot of practitioners, empiricists have used Habermas as an ideal. It's not an ideal at all, it's a fiction. It will be the next book, I think, to written back on this question of fiction. While many analyses claim to be about deliberation and evaluating it, and while deliberative experiments in many publics are growing exponentially, we must be aware of indicated and unresolved problems on the theoretical side in order to be able to choose the relevant conditions for a good debate. And the communication associated with deliberation does not simply aim at a description of the work, individual expressions or impressions or feelings. It must make it possible to express expectations, judge, change, and commit to doing so. And beyond the respect of the participants in the debate, communication is constructed thanks to an order of discourse, un ordre du discours, largely inherited from rhetoric. And it was not by chance that rhetoric has been invented when democracy became more complex, but it's not the complexity we have nowadays. This order, if neglected, the order of the discourse, contributes to the chaos of the word and the disorder of its future. Narration, interpretation, and argumentation organize this order of discourse differently. It's not only a theoretical question, it's very practically. It is not only a question of narrative warfare, a popular expression today, and presented wrongly as a discovery. These communicative capacities help in the coordination and risk-taking of conversation, in the expression of disagreements and uncertainties, and the careful investigation of deliberation. And these abilities, in the case of consideration, take care of both the partners in the discussion and all of the dimensions of the examinations that need to be taken into account. Consideration, by its conceptual richness, brings together into play levels, domains, aspects of communication and reflection, individual and collective. And finally, the book presents the condition of 3 very large-scale debates that were recently conducted in a large democracy in France, the great national debates, the Grand Débat National, the Citizen Convention for the Climate, and the debate of a very large region, the Convention Citoyenne d'Occitanie, Occitanie Citizen Convention, a place in France as large as Belgium. And the conditions for implementing these debates are not only normative, but also contextual. And there, in every chapter, I use what is discussed on a theoretical level to have some insight on these 3 interesting debates. And we will afterwards, in the second turn, go to the so what question.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and we look forward to your answer for the second question. But before this, last but not least, let's go back to Geneva and giving the floor to Janina Welp. Janina.
Yeah, thanks, Min. Our book is Deliberative Constitution Making. I think, Min, you are adding the link. It's published in open access. The direct answer to the why this is is an outcome of the cost action, constitution making, and deliberative democracy. The cost action was promoted by Min. He chaired the action for a long time, and I ended the job, and we co-edited this book together. The cost action is addressed to create or reinforce networks of researchers working on similar topics in European and non-European countries. And the book is a product of that. And in this sense, the novelty is that it's not a theoretical book or a book about normative aspects, although we do include one chapter which is more theoretical. But the main idea was to broaden the discussion on constitution making and deliberation in different ways. First of all, when we talk about constitution making, we are not only talking about constitutions or laws, but also to the basic agreements a society has when dealing with public goods and public common sense, the idea of the future, together, citizenship, etc. So in this sense, we include many different approaches. Just to give an example, one of the chapters deals with kids' participation as an issue, how a society should deal with the political participation of kids and young people. In the same way, we are not taking deliberation as something given, but as something problematic and polysemic. And in that way, we can see that nowadays the discussion about deliberation is mostly oriented to rethink or think in new institutions of participation. While if we go back in history, the main institution promoting deliberation is parliament. So it's like a more historical and complex approach. In the same way, in the book, we are not only covering democratic countries, but also authoritarian, because authoritarian countries also need some forms of legitimation and to include the people in some ways to improve governance. So we have, for instance, a study of the use of referendums in Italy, which is, of course, a democracy, but also Russia and Turkey. We also do include the typical experiences with new democratic innovations like sorted assemblies in Ireland and in Iceland, but including new approaches. In the case of the Nordic countries, there is an approach to the decolonial aspect of these projects of deliberation. Also, we include the role of ethnic groups when discussing inclusion, which is a quite relevant topic. ICTs for participation, there is a chapter on that. And what more? And gender. We also included a chapter dealing with gender and political participation and deliberation. And we are not arriving to like close conclusions in the book, but we do have some kind of bullet points, let's say, for further, to expand the conversation and for further research. Just to mention a few, I already said about deliberation as a polysemic concept, then inclusiveness as a necessary concept, but insufficient condition for democracy as a complex one. And I think when we talk about sorted assemblies, we are now dealing with the with the problems associated to just stay with the idea of descriptive representation, just as an example. Also, when looking at the case of Chile, we see that participation per se doesn't resolve the legitimacy deficit. So just to include, a huge process of participation does not resolve the legitimacy deficit, and Chile is a good example, but we can find other examples. Then we also consider the very important role of institutional designs in general for institutions of citizen participation, which may be very well designed to engage the people in the process of deliberation, but at the same time not well connected to the policy making or not well connected to the general public. And then just to close, we also find given an important role to politics in the struggles to change institutions and better to say, in the struggle to change institutions, power plays a very important role. So when we talk normally about democratic innovations, it seems that it's a kind of pure solution to the democratic deficits, but when we analyze specific cases, we do find that the institutions of citizen participation are also part of these power struggles in many senses. So in this way, I think the book is more oriented to understand citizens' deliberation and deliberation in general in a more pragmatic term in place of from a normative approach.
Thank you very much, Janina. Very insightful. Let's continue the conversations and let's go back to, let's go to a second round around the question of what is the main challenge that you still, you feel that it needs to still to be tackled, or in other words, the so what question. Let's go in the same order as we did for the first one. So Adrian, if you want the floor, it is for you.
Yeah, so I've thinking about this over the past day or two, and I'm going to go big in terms of what the main challenge is social movements and democratic innovations face, which is sort of the topic of our book. So I'll go big, and then I'll go small, or I'll outline a problem and then a sort of strategy. I think it's probably a better way of thinking about it. In terms of the problem, I'm going big. I think that the main challenge, not just to radical forms of participatory governance, but to democracy in general, it is the influence of capitalist development upon democracy. Now, participatory governance and democratic innovations often face the risk of being co-opted by the political economy which we live in, and this can severely hamper transformative potential. Co-optation can be instrumental as elites shape initiatives to serve their ends, but it's more often a systemic issue. And I don't want to get too abstract, but one of the things that makes capital's rule such a tough nut to crack is that as it grows, it enmeshes us, organizations, and the state into it by tying the means by which we satisfy our needs and wants into its very own circulation. So that's very abstract. I can expand on that later if needed. And I think that's the problem, and it produces a very strong cooptative power that needs to be understood and then reckoned with. And apologies just for drawing out one of the contributions from before. It would be beyond my capacity to draw links between all of the books. But I think Brigitta's point that paternalistic democratic innovations, and I would agree, are especially sort of inoffensive to that kind of issue. And actually, by imposing democracy from the top down in response to this crisis, it actually might, if I speculate, might be contributing to the disembedding of democracy from the civil societies, or the societies which, I've not read the book, but from which Brigitta's project would like to sort of more organically, for democracy to more organically sort of flow from. And I think we very much are on the same page there. And Sonia, I worked with Sonia on a project she led on embedding participatory governance, which might be interesting. But in the book, beyond the sort of structural limitations, we want to focus on the spaces for agency with that backdrop. We want to focus on the spaces for agency and the democratic forms of organizing human activity that we see around the world. So we focused on social movements and their interactions with democratic innovation. And I want to begin by saying we shouldn't fetishize social movements. Firstly, we've been taught, and this is not a new lesson, but we see a lot today that they can be very reactionary. But even in progressive social movements, there can be very undemocratic practices. But we think that at least they can be a source of new ideas and practices which can be disruptive. But moving beyond protest and disruption, we focus on what they produce when they interact with state institutions through participatory governance. And the challenge that many of the chapters are sort of dealing around, and in the conclusion, Gianpaolo Vaiocchi summarizes it as sort of chapters, common theme being constraining and enabling background features. The challenge involves understanding how to design and implement participatory practices that genuinely challenge existing power structures and promote democracy. And the kinds of experiments in the book originate from what we could call democratic moments that are characterized by lots of citizen involvement and agency. But these moments are hard to sustain precisely because they require a lot of collective action and lots of continuous input from citizens. So part of the wager is that participatory, and we saw this in Spain a lot, especially on the chapters on Spain, is that participatory governance can lower the costs of sustaining that collective action or substitute for it in some way by institutionalizing participation. Now, there's clear dangers that I spoke about before around co-option, but the idea is that it can carry through some of that momentum of the democratic moment into public administration. And the issue here is obviously that as democratic moments wane, elites, which were initially wrong-footed and politically disadvantaged by new developments, find ways to adapt to and shape new institutions. And a probably paradigmatic case of this would be the internet, for example, recently. A space for democratic freedom in the 1990s, and now one of humongous capital concentration and privatization and control. And we see these stories around this sort of, and it speaks to the dynamism between GDD and DDG, sort of transformative moments that wrong-foot elites, and then the cycles of sort of normalization and institutionalization that sort of blunt the initial instrument. And this means that in the end, the systems that they sort of arose in opposition to can end up being reinforced. But basically the challenge is understanding whether and how social movements and participatory governance can sustain these moments and keep spaces, the spaces for agency they generate for longer, and more successfully embed changes within civil society, economy, and the state. And then the different chapters in the book look at different angles, look at this from different angles. And I'll stop there because maybe over time.
Yeah, this is very, very fine, Adrian. Thank you very much for this. It feeds indeed our conversation. Let's continue with Brigitte.
You know, this is a very good question. What do you think are the main challenges faced by this concept of self-governing? Actually, I haven't really thought it through, but I try to make to mention some challenges. I mean, for citizens, for politicians, for us as political scientists. I mean, for citizens, of course, the challenge is that most citizens have never really thought about the setup of their democracy. They're so used to representative democracy, to elections, and they're just starting to get an idea that democracy can look different. So this will take a lot of time, and to get knowledge, time, experience. So I think this is really a big challenge to for them to think about something they have now at this point absolutely nothing to say, but on a long run, you know, to start thinking about something that might have some impact in some distant future. So I think this is really a challenge for citizens to invest time in this. For politicians, of course, I mean, it's a challenge. It's always difficult to give up power. I mean, it would mean to step back and say, maybe we are not the best to govern. Maybe we need different forms of government, not only representative. So why should they do this? So I also think this is really difficult. For political scientists, it would also mean that we change our way of research. For example, for political theorists, what Assenbaum says, or what Assenbaum, for example, Hans Assenbaum does, to include citizens' perspective on political theory and democratic theory in theory making, or for comparativists looking for a comparative or scrutinize the impacts of democratic innovations in different contexts would be our task then. So all in all, I think a transformation towards self-governing, how can we get there? It's a very incremental, long-lasting way, and I'm sometimes asked, how can you get there? I don't know. It's still a little bit of a gap between the ideas and our current society, and the way seems to be very complicated and long. So I can just have to talk about the challenges, obviously, and the problems. So yeah, okay, that's from my side.
Thank you very much, Brigitte, and I'm sure there will be more questions coming to continue the reflections. Let's go now to Bernard. Bernard, do you want to tackle this question?
Yes, the so what question and the future, I can put it, the link between trust and responsibilities. And by the way, thank you for the hyperlink. The book is written in French, but translated into English. It's not published, but don't worry for the people who don't speak French. There is a possibility. So often the notion of responsibility in its various meaning, because on a normative side, moral responsibility, you can have at least 10 different meanings, is absent from reflection in political domain. If we follow, for example, Rosan Vallon 2015, he thinks that in the executive, for example, political executive, we have almost nothing on responsibilities. Where, however, the entanglement responsibility is omnipresent. If you follow, for example, Bovens at Italy, whether for institutionally distributed responsibilities or in the very way in which those elected or chosen carry their responsibilities. Many of the problems concerning trust and distrust in politics have something to do with accountability, and the accountability question regarding this deliberative experiments is really important. I've not seen a lot of way to succeed, to be successful in this step of to be accountable, and it is often through criticisms that the responsibility of others is called into question, and yet the call to answer for is often overwhelmed by criticism in its primary and reactive form of negative sanction without developed judgment or a justification. And in order to consider different forms of questioning and criticism, the answer for making our responsibility explicit can find its place within a framework such as conversation, we forget it, deliberation, of course, and consideration, mobilizing communicative capacities ranging from the questions, the very questions, to arguments. And the links between communication and accountability are of great importance for democratic life. They take the form of increasing demands for participation or deliberation claimed as innovative, or new demands on democracy. And however, many theoretical problems remain. I've spoken about Rawls and Habermas before, but we have to move ahead. And it is therefore necessary to revisit and take the deliberation further in order to better ground it and to be able to carry out more current empirical work. We should not shelter under their misunderstood authority And on the contrary, it is advisable to favor a more experimental and pragmatic logic, and at the same time learn from these trials without rushing too quickly towards these or those which form institutionalization. And to finish, in this book, I've tried to move a bit ahead and to propose other candidates. We have not only deliberation, we can have conversation with, when you have good conversation, you take risk, you improvise, you return back to oral discussion. If you return back to Dewey, Oakeshott, and Michel de Montaigne, for example. And consideration, I think it's a possible promise, which is the other side of resentment or defiant criticisms. And if you return back in the first chapter of the book, we have done an interesting inquiry with quantitative sociologists from our lab and philosopher to test different kind of critical citizenship, and not only the defiant one, the distrust, but different levels of critiques. And I've read interesting article by Brigitte, what is a democracy without criticism, without critics? It's a poor democracy, of course. And indeed, consideration creates trust, which is essential for our collective action between individual and towards institution. And I will stop with there. We have time. Yeah, 4 minutes is enough.
Thank you very much, Bernard. And you already spark elements of the discussion. I see that Brigitte was nodding to what you were saying. But before going back to Geneva and give the floor to Janina for her answer to the second question, the so what question, I want to already announce that we will go then after Janina's response to Q&A session. So you can already ask your question via the chat if you wish. The people in Geneva can already prepare the question on paper if they wish, but so you can get prepared for continuing the conversations. But Janina, the floor is yours.
Yeah, just to reflect on challenges. Of course, we could talk about many different aspects. I would like to stress for our conversation today 5 aspects. The first one is about the relation between a very high level of expectancies on democratic innovations and the evaluation of quite poor results with few exceptions, which I think is related to 2 aspects. On the one hand, these expectancies, if we think, just to give an example, how the diagnosis is made on how an institution can contribute to change the way in which democracy works. If we go back to the origins of participatory budgeting, when it started to be promoted internationally, there were many publications talking about participatory budgeting as an institution to really revitalize democracy, change democracy, transform it radically. And if you look at the institution, it's hard to understand how the discussion about the small level of the budget can, at the local level, with a very clear and narrow frame of what can be implemented through the institution, can change democracy in a radical way. It's clearly that is out of the scope of participatory budgeting. So I think these high expectancies are not really funded by what the institution can do. But then at the same time, I would say, and thinking in Hirschman's reading of what is success, that this led to the opposite, to say it doesn't matter and it's all the same and it plays no role at all. We see through the Latin American experience, for instance, that participatory budgeting plays a very important role building social capital. So it's not revolutionizing democracy, but it's doing a very good contribution in some places, of course, because it works under X conditions, not in any case. So I think it would be really necessary to frame better the conversation. And of course, we could talk about citizens' assembly with a similar approach. Then a second point is on the role of the intermediaries. I think this particularly from some social movements and activists promoting direct forms of participation was an idea that democracy is much better if it's bottom-up and if we have like the people, the real people. And sociology has shown us for many years that there are there's plenty of intermediaries. It's not only about political parties or social movements, but also about the media, about the academic institutions, about many other institutions. And I think this role of intermediaries also needs to be better understood. And probably the Chilean case is a very good example of how the misunderstanding can lead to bad results in some cases. Then a third point is the discussion on politics and politicization. I think quite often there is a kind of overlapping between what is partisan politics and what is politicization of the topics. And this is quite present on the discussion on citizens' assembly, the idea that pure people with no partisan background will be better to join a conversation than partisan actors, which I think is plenty of misunderstandings, this idea. Then a fourth point is about the role of agencies in the promotion of democratic innovations. There are some studies on participatory budgeting. I think maybe it's time to go further and see how also agencies are playing a role in the dissemination of citizens' assemblies, which is good in some contexts, and this is my fifth point, context, but in others could be really disturbing. And I'm thinking in the case of El Salvador, for instance, where you have a process of autocratization, and then if in the international environment is said that a pure citizens' assembly composed by sorted people would be more democratic than the institutions elected, maybe we are providing instruments to authoritarian leaders to legitimize authoritarian forms. So I think it's quite dangerous. And again, in Western countries, maybe some people is not aware of the danger of some decontextualized conversations when the claim is this is universal and is located in a very specific context and could be dangerous in a different context. So finally, context as something to consider more carefully. And I stop there.
Well, thank you, Janina, and thank you all for your answer to these two tricky questions. We have already a couple of questions online, and I think the easiest is that the person can ask themselves the question if they wish. But I would suggest that we do a ping pong between online and in Geneva. So if people around the table will also ask questions, that would also be nice. But maybe to get started, we could give the floor to Nina. Nina, would you like to ask your question? Oh no, Nina said that that's the answer to Terry, Boris's question about the recording. Then we could go to Reinhard. Reinhard, you want to ask your question?
Yes, I can ask my question.
The floor is
I would
yours.
like to know, because I don't think we live in a real democracy as long as administrations and corporations are not democratic. I've asked this question several times in German administrations. Why don't we elect all senior administrators and executive people? That would be true democracy, because I mean, we spend most of our time working in corporations and administrations, and they have a huge influence on governments. So to say we live in a democracy just because we elect a few politicians every few years is, in my opinion, meaningless. I mean, maybe it has some symbolic meaning, but it's not really effective as far as I can tell from my experience. So please respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Reinhard, and I'm sure some of the authors will do have an answer or elements to this. Is there any question in Geneva around the table? Not at this stage? No?
Yeah, we have one.
Yeah, please go.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who's already shared. I mean, these are very interesting pieces that you all have been working on. So thank you for taking the time today. I think one of my questions was conceptual and the other one was more sort of empirical. So on the conceptual level, it seems like, at least in your case, for example, you mentioned that there is, you looked intentionally at a polysemic kind of version of democratic innovation to try and make it inclusive and to really sort of put as much in there. But I'm curious then, how do you draw the boundaries in terms of saying this is a democratic innovation and what's something that's worth sort of studying. And so that can go to, I think, everybody else as well. How much similarity is there actually in the concept that we're sort of using here across these different sort of books versus is the concept of defined more towards like an end that we have in mind rather than sort of a sort of ontological reality. And then the second thing was just kind of on the empiric. We talked a lot about participatory budgeting today, which I found quite interesting. In a past life, I was quite involved in this and was also part of the team then that helps create what is People Power today, if you're familiar with the organization, Josh Lerner's organization. But one of the things that stands out to me, having played that role in that and other sort of projects, is not just the World Bank necessarily, and the role the World Bank has played in participatory budgeting, but even in some of these more civil society, democracy, sort of more, if we will, sort of on the social movement side of these innovations. Oftentimes, there's a very large role of funding agencies. So donors, oftentimes philanthropies from the US or a few countries in Europe that sort of really are quite, I think, pivotal in defining, at least creating the space, the funding, and the sort of maintenance for some of these efforts. So I'm curious, how in your sort of studies have you been able to disentangle that agency, or to what extent do you see those as sort of playing a very pivotal role? But if you were to sort of take them out of some of the pictures of these examples, to what extent would that change the sort of the results of the analysis? So those are two things that I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Thank you very much. And then I would suggest that we take another question, well, a question from Nivek. Nivek, would you like to ask a question yourself?
Thanks, Min. I suppose it's mainly directed at Brigitte, but anybody could answer. I've had conversations with people and they've suggested that, designing democratic practice is, best left to experts. And I know that sounds very paternalistic, and we could easily just reject it for that reason. But I just wonder, how you think citizens, I know you've talked about it being very slow and incremental, but, what process is needed for citizens to understand the choices and the outcomes of different choices in designing a good democratic practice?
Thank you, Nivek. And I would suggest that if you still have questions, please use the chat, and then we'll go back to Geneva, but to give back the floor to our authors and maybe following the same order as before. So Adrian, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I was making some notes. So to the first question, I didn't quite catch the name. Sorry, Reinhardt. Yeah, this is something I've thought about a lot. It was one of the reasons why I'm sort of doing what I do now in the field of democratic innovation, as I sort of grew frustrated with the notion that there was lots of these great ideas around institutional design and all this really amazing academic work around how to improve engagement was being put into institutions that often have very little power. So I became interested in how to innovate democracy, seeing the results of the financial crash, which especially politicized me. How to innovate democracy in international finance, for example. I've not figured that one out yet, but it's something that took me to critical political economy, and it's something that I think is absolutely crucial, to do. And I think what we're trying to get at with democracy-driven governance, which is the concept that vertebrates the book, is precisely this. It might not be, full-on sort of socialism, so to speak, but it's about expanding the regulatory scope. Part of it is about expanding the regulatory scope of democracy beyond the confines which neoliberalism places it in. And that's a really difficult thing to do. The extent to which the cases in the book report on advances of that on that are quite limited because they're often local level experiments. So there's some things there around the cooperative economy, but mainly these kinds of issues, and this is a sort of criticism of lots of these movements that the book reports on, weren't really focused around economic production. They were more responding to the nature of the crisis, which was about social reproduction, right? So it's about housing, thinking about Spain here, different sort of issues around the welfare state, etc. So it's trying to sort of rethink how we solve that. Then the person from Geneva didn't quite get your name, I'm sorry. So the question about the influence of funding agencies in participatory budgeting, I don't have much to say on that. I think that's sort of very problematic issue. It has to do with where the money is, right? It's where investment comes from, and this is part of the structural power of capital. And we're working on a paper, very initial, that's trying to use Bourdieu, complement Marx with Bourdieu to try and understand how the normalization and co-option of these kinds of processes occurs through cultural capital, not just economic forms of capital. But I think that these agencies are sort of key examples here of, let's say, engines of isomorphism, sort of fast policy transfer, people trying to make their careers and cutting and pasting these sorts of processes. And I think that links in a little bit to what Janina was saying about PB. I had to go out of the room because I just moved to a new flat and I'm sort of receiving stuff. So, but I caught something around, PB not being a tool, the expectations point, right? And I agree that there's really often that's a key issue. The expectations are set really too high. Often it's to do with activist discourses that try to sort of get people involved and, to sort of try to go past the threshold point of participation beyond which, the process can begin to work. So I agree with you that is a contradiction or a tension there. But I disagree with, I'm not an expert on PB, but if we go back to Porto Alegre, I don't think it is to say that it is expecting too much for PB to democratize other spheres of life, because it had impacts outside of the process. And that was the point, right? That was part of the design, actually, to animate the formation of associations, to thicken out civil society, especially in poor areas, in ways that might link into what Brigitte is thinking about. And I've not read the book, but in terms of a more organic bottom-up form of democracy, I think PB in Porto Alegre, this might be a very tired point to make, but I think it might be an example of how the very operations of the state through good design and a good political party with a good left strategy can actually sort of do that, right? So that's a not very well worked out thought there, but just maybe some conversation on that. And then finally, Nivek, very quickly, can experts design institutions? I think that there's a role for expertise. I think we've focused on it far too much. And I will cite a theorist I'm reading quite a lot of now, Denis Pellon from the University of York, who argues that institutions are democratic insofar as social struggle forces democracy upon them. So to my mind, the important here isn't, I just made a point about good design in Porto Alegre, but the main thing is this, let's say, dialectic relationship between the participatory institution and civil society, and the way in which the participatory institution enables or doesn't enable civil society and social movements to exercise power through them, and what kinds of power resources does it open up for people to exercise, and then exercise that pressure through which we can at least gain concessions from power. And I'll stop there. Sorry.
Thank you, Adrian. And if there are other questions, remaining questions, please shoot on the chat or raise your hands in Geneva, because time is flying, and so we won't have another round of discussion. So if ever there are still questions that you want to share to the speakers, please do so. But without transition, then maybe giving the floor to Brigitte.
Thank you. I have two short questions to Reinhard and to Nivek. First to Reinhard. It very much reminded me of Pateman's The Participatory Democracy, the book, where she suggested there's democracy in all spaces of life. I mean, at the workplace and everywhere. This idea seemed to be very prominent in the 70s, but now it's no longer en vogue, as it seemed to me. At least there's no longer a big discussion, but it was a big discussion about this idea to democratize all spaces in life. We now have it more in this democracy learning, democracy as a way of life discussions, but no longer there. I think that's all I can say on this topic. For Nivek, yes, I like this argument because when democracy started, there was always this argument: ordinary people cannot elect, the representatives. Then women are just not capable of electing their representatives. People of color, I mean, we cannot give them vote. These were all these arguments because these people are not, these ordinary people or whatever people, are not able. They are too dumb. It's too complicated for them. They cannot really make a good decision between the different candidates. And so this is a very old argument. But as it turned out, it didn't. I mean, we have democracy and we have one woman, one person, one man, one vote. So, and then my second answer would be, I think we as like those who know a lot about democratic innovations and have expertise, I mean, it's our task to provide this information to those who don't have the time, of course, to do research and everything. And I mean, to be honest, I mean, I would ask those people who have this argument, what is so complex about explaining how a mini public works? It's not really very complex. I mean, you can talk about the different contexts, you can talk about the different forms of direct democracy, but every person in Switzerland understands bottom-up, top-down direct democracy. So it's obviously understandable. So, but it's a topic it's an argument that comes up, but I never found it very convincing for these reasons. Thanks.
Thank you, Brigitte. If there are questions in Geneva before we give the floor to Bernard, no question around the table. Yes, please.
Yes, well, first, thanks all for your presentations. The book sounds very interesting, so I'm gonna read them. And I was thinking sometimes we have some institutions, some participatory mechanism, institutionalized existing in our countries, but the participation, the citizen participation is always challenging in these existing institutions. And I was thinking in your research, maybe you found some strategies to promote the participation of citizens in these existing institutions. And I would like to hear about those strategies to improve participation in existing institutions. That's all. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this question. Are there any remaining questions online before we give the floor back to Bernard? Not at this stage. Bernard, the floor is yours.
Yes, I will try to make a combination of the different questions to answer. First of all, for the first question, to put it in another way, from a philosophical perspective, you are never living in the democracy. You are very glad that you are living in a world where we have a series of rights, where we have democratical institutions, but we can improve a lot. Otherwise, we stop our job as philosopher. We have finished. So I can partially agree with you, but you have some distinction. The big companies or a company is a private or semi-private place. It's not the place where you discuss all the political life. I know that they have influence on the political life, and for these reasons, we can have different laws that are voted or actions to constrain this enterprise to behave in such a way. And don't forget that sometimes we have what we call, I know it exists not only in France, but social democracy, so the democracy sociale inside the enterprises and the relationships between the trade unions. And at the end, even in a private company, when you have to tackle a question, it's true that you cannot decide who will be the chief, excepting in a startup, but you discuss. And the frame of the discussion very often comes from a kind of deliberative frame or something like that. You have to convince and to justify. And I think with the experience we have tried to show, what is interesting is that we have a view on what it is to move from legal citizenship to practical or real practice of your citizenship inside a group where you have to recognize a very difficult question, is the question of pluralism, the recognition of a moral pluralism regarding questions, for example, as justice. It was the case of the Citizen Convention for the Climate. How is it possible to imagine the ecological transition in a spirit of justice? And to tackle this question, I think, and to have the possibility to discuss them with new actors, it's a step forward in the not only improvement but deepening of the democratical promises. And to finish with the question of how can we present to the citizen chosen by sortition, for example, in the Citizen Convention, what are the different choice of design? Min knows that very well because he has been in the same College of Guarantors with the last Citizen Convention on the end of life in France. It's really interesting to see that we have many different possible choices, but what is really interesting is the why question. Why do you justify this choice and not the other one? And very often we have many possibilities, but when you have decided one, you exclude others. It does not mean that you've done wrong, but you will have different kind of ways and results. And for the strategies and the existing institution, I think it's why I'm a bit. I think that we have to work more on the question of deliberative system and to put it very clear. The book of Parkinson and Mansbridge, it's only a thing where you want to embrace everything. No, we have to find the different possible connections. It's a work for lawyers working on the constitution, but for philosophers too, or practitioners, to use in the proper way the results from this kind of mini publics, and to give them respective responsibilities regarding the existing common and differentiated responsibilities we have in the system.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Very insightful. We will give the floor back, of course, to Giannina. She will be the last one to speak, but if there are any remaining questions, please shoot. Otherwise, Giannina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Min. Yeah, I will quickly answer the remaining questions. The democratic innovation, your question on the definition. I always said this concept is really a confusing concept. The idea of democratic first, because then if you really go for that, the first point is to analyze if it's democratic or not. And this is quite problematic. And innovations, in which the important thing is that if it's a new thing, if it's innovative in these terms. And I think it's very confusing and probably so successful because it's connected to the second part of your question on how it spreads and in the agencies behind that, etc., etc. But back to the first question, I think it's much more useful to think and work with the concept of institutions of citizen participation. And then, yes, normal elections are the first and more important institution of citizen participation. And then what defines an institution of citizen participation is this engagement of citizens, which needs to be active. So could be binding or not, could include vote or not, but has to be active. So providing information is something else. To answer a survey is something else. No, it's my view on this point. Then, Adrian, I agree with you on the reading of Porto Alegre. I think goes in the same direction of what I said. Brigitte, I want to stress that because I think was also a very good example. When we talk about the complexity of some instruments of participation, if we look at the Swiss system of direct democracy, when you have a counter proposal and you have like many different options in one single ballot box, for Swiss people it's not complex anymore because they are used. So it's a question of learning by using it, which I think was your point, Brigitte, and I really agree with that. It's a question of perceiving how meaningful an institution is and learning how to use it. And also, I think the Swiss system also shows that has been changing a long time. It's not the same from the very beginning. It has new institutions, some amendments, the role of the parliament, the counter proposal, etc., etc. So it's very interesting to look at this historical process of making Swiss direct democracy. And then finally, I'm very quick and provocative for Ita's question. I always wonder why in all this conversation about institutions of citizen participation, never is present the discussion on why it's not an option to make vote mandatory, which of course in your country is mandatory, but in Europe it's not mandatory. So if we are really so interested in engaging people, why to focus all the activity on institutions with very low impact on policy making, and there is no conversation, like public, important conversation on mandatory voting? It's not answering your question, but I think it's part of that. And then also I think in the same way, I'm quite in favor of introducing referendums, like in the Swiss or Uruguayan design, because I think as soon as people feel that they can really have an impact on policy making, then they participate. And this is part also on this conversation. Why the electoral participation is declining? Because in some periods, recent historical periods, people started to feel that was the same, which I don't think is the same, but this was a feeling. And then with the emergence of populist parties and so on, electoral participation also increased in countries like Spain or France. So I think it's an interesting point to keep talking about that. And yeah, I think, we are in time. Maybe do you want
2 minutes
to
left.
or I don't know if someone, I don't know, it's your moderation.
Well, if anyone wants to use the next 50 seconds or 60 seconds, the floor is open to anyone. If not, I would like to thank you very much all again, because it was a real conversation that at least I enjoyed it. I hope you did as well. As you've seen, you can watch again or share the recording on the YouTube of the Aldo Eichmann Center, so you can go back to this. And before I close this, I would then wish you a good evening or good afternoon, depending of where you are. But thank you very much again for joining, and to be continued.
Thank you.
Thank you, Min. Thank you, everybody. And nice evening.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.